The story of modern China cannot be told without the long shadow of two intertwined struggles: the brutal invasion by Imperial Japan and the civil war between the Nationalists and the Communists. For more than 2 decades, the fate of a nation was decided on battlefields, in city streets, and within the hearts of hundreds of millions. This was not merely a war of armies, but a war of ideas, identity, and survival, a crucible from which the People's Republic of China would emerge. In the late 1920s, China was a fractured land. The Qing dynasty had fallen in 1911, but the promise of a united republic quickly dissolved into chaos. Warlords carved up provinces into private kingdoms. Foreign powers still controlled concessions in Shanghai, Tianjin, and other port cities, reminders of the humiliations of the Opium Wars. Into this chaos stepped two rival visions of China's future. On one side stood the Kuomintang, or Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who sought to forge a modern, centralized state. On the other, the Chinese Communist Party, born in 1921 under the influence of Marxist revolutionaries, offered a radical alternative, a peasant-led socialist movement. The stage was set in 1927, when the fragile alliance between nationalists and communists collapsed. During what became known as the Shanghai Massacre, Chiang Kai-shek ordered a violent purge of communist forces in the city. Thousands were arrested, executed, or forced underground. The First United Front was shattered, and the Chinese Civil War began. As Chiang consolidated power, his armies pushed the communists into rural strongholds. It was here, in the remote villages and mountain valleys, that Mao Zedong began developing his vision of a revolution rooted not in the urban workers, as orthodox Marxism prescribed, but in the vast peasant population of China. His theories, dismissed at first by many within his own party, would later prove decisive. But China's agony was far from internal alone. Across the sea, Imperial Japan looked hungrily toward the Asian mainland. Industrial expansion and militarist ideology drove Tokyo's ambitions. In 1931, under a manufactured pretext, Japanese forces invaded Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the action, but little more. The world was already sliding toward greater conflict, and China stood alone. The Chinese Civil War, raging since 1927, was interrupted by a greater threat. In July 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing ignited full-scale war between China and Japan. Japanese divisions surged into northern China, capturing Beijing and Tianjin, then advancing toward Shanghai and Nanjing. The nationalist government moved its capital inland, but not before catastrophe struck. In December 1937, Nanjing fell. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. For 6 weeks, Japanese troops carried out mass executions, widespread rape, and looting in what is remembered as the Nanjing Massacre. Estimates of the dead range from 200,000 to 300,000. The river ran red with bodies. The testimony of survivors, preserved in diaries and photographs, remains searing evidence of the scale of atrocity. Faced with annihilation, the warring Chinese factions were forced into uneasy cooperation. Under international pressure and patriotic fervor, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong agreed to form the Second United Front. Nationalist and communist forces coordinated, though often only nominally, against the Japanese invader. Still, the war effort was marked by mistrust. While Chiang's armies engaged in set-piece battles, often suffering devastating losses, The Communists waged guerrilla campaigns in the countryside, expanding their influence among peasants and presenting themselves as the true defenders of the Chinese nation. The war against Japan was long and brutal. Cities were bombed, farmlands burned, and millions displaced. Famine stalked the countryside, yet Chinese resistance endured. With the outbreak of the wider Second World War in 1939, aid began to flow first from the Soviet Union, later from the United States after 1941. American General Joseph Stilwell worked to coordinate the fractured Chinese forces, but relations with Chiang Kai-shek were strained. Chiang, ever wary of communist strength, often conserved his forces, while Mao's partisans deepened their roots in the rural heartland. By 1945, Japan was exhausted. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, coupled with Soviet entry into the war, brought Tokyo's surrender. For China, however, peace did not come. Instead, the fragile unity shattered once more. With the Japanese defeated, the Chinese Civil War resumed more ferocious than ever. Now the stakes were absolute: control over the destiny of China. Chiang's nationalists held the cities, the bureaucracy, and international recognition. Mao's communists controlled vast swathes of the countryside, with hardened guerrilla forces and growing popular support. The United States supplied the nationalists, while the Soviet Union armed the communists, transferring captured Japanese weaponry in Manchuria. From 1946 to 1949, the conflict escalated into full-scale war. Nationalist armies, initially stronger, launched offensives but were plagued by corruption, inflation, and declining morale. Soldiers went unpaid, equipment was mismanaged, and the public grew disillusioned with Chiang's regime. By contrast, communist forces maintained strict discipline, promising land reform and fair treatment. In the villages, peasants increasingly sided with Mao. The decisive campaigns came in 1948 and 1949 in Manchuria. The Liaoshan campaign annihilated nationalist forces. The Weihai campaign, fought across central China, broke the back of Chiang's armies, and in the Pinjin campaign, communist troops encircled and captured Beijing without destroying the ancient city. The speed and scale of these victories stunned the world. On October 1, 1949, standing atop Tiananmen Gate in Beijing, Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China. Red flags filled the square as millions celebrated. For Mao, it was the culmination of a vision nurtured over 2 decades of struggle. For Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists, it was the end of their rule on the mainland. Retreating with 2 million followers, Chiang established a government in exile on the island of Taiwan, where the Republic of China endures to this day. The immediate aftermath of victory was both hopeful and grim. On one hand, after a century of humiliation and decades of war, China was unified under a single government. On the other, the costs were staggering. Between 1927 and 1949, tens of millions perished killed in combat, massacred in atrocities, or dead from famine and displacement. Entire cities lay in ruins, and the countryside was scarred. Families were torn apart, loyalties divided, and memories haunted by bloodshed. The legacy of these years is profound. For the communists, the narrative of heroic resistance against Japan and victory over a corrupt regime became the founding myth of modern China. The Long March, the resistance at Yan'an, and the triumph at Tiananmen became cornerstones of national identity. For the nationalists in Taiwan, survival and persistence against overwhelming odds shaped a separate but enduring story. And for Japan, the invasion of China remains one of the most painful and contested chapters of its 20th century history, with debates over memory and responsibility continuing into the present. Today, the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Chinese Civil War are remembered not only as struggles for political power, but as defining events in the forging of modern Asia. They reshaped the balance of global power, laying the foundations for the Cold War in the East. China emerged not as a victim, but as a great power, its people hardened by sacrifice and determined to rebuild. And yet the scars remain. Memorials in Nanjing, battle sites in Manchuria, and the divided Taiwan Strait are all living reminders of how history continues to shape the present. The story of 1927 to 1949 is not only the story of China's past, it is a lens through which we understand its present and future. This has been a journey through one of the most turbulent chapters in human history, a story of betrayal and unity, invasion and resistance, collapse and rebirth. It is a reminder that nations are not simply born, they are forged in fire, tested by trial, and defined by memory. Creating this episode required weaving together fragments of testimony, records, and scholarship, a small effort to honor the immense suffering and resilience of those who lived through it. If you value detailed, high-quality historical storytelling, your support ensures that these stories that shaped the world we know continue to be told.